So it's been a while since Willie, Carel, myself got together. There's been some um, things happening, both in South Africa and on my side. But we're back, and we're excited to continue our journey in Revelation. And I've had some really good feedback. It's definitely very topical, especially in the times we are living in. So today we will be reviewing Revelation 8, the seventh seal and the golden censer. And there's a lot of information here, so I'm looking forward to gaining some insight from Willie and Carel. So welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I'm going to quickly start by just going and looking at verse 1 to 5. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer, with the prayers of all God's people, and on the golden altar in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Quite a dramatic start. So I think what we're going to look at, not just Revelation 8, but sort of pull some of Ezekiel into that as well, Willie?
Yeah, so what if we've previously seen it, but today we can focus in more detail on the fact that, especially in this part of Revelation, the author borrows quite a lot of the images from Ezekiel. And there's good reason for that. As we progress with our discussion, it's quite clear that similar things that Ezekiel has spoken of is also obviously referred to and, related to the things that's happening in, or is prophesied to happen in the book of Revelation. But when he starts here with the altar in heaven, first the silence. Now remember, there are 7 seals. So this is the 7th seal that has been broken. The whole book, with all the prophecies that we've read about in chapter 5, all the prophecies are sealed with just 7 seals. So now the first 6 seals we've seen, this gives a kind of an overview. And then with the 7th seal, we get into the details. And with the 7 seals start, the next step is then the 7 trumpets. And today we will discuss the first 4 trumpets, which is actually those described in this chapter, chapter 8. And then after the seal is broken, there's silence in heaven. And then we read about this altar in heaven. Now, what is interesting is that there's a kind of a mirror image between what we read about that's defined in heaven and what was also in the time of the Israelites found on earth in the form of the tabernacle and later on in the temple. And the reason for this is that we read that Moses made everything according to the plan showed him. And that's the heavenly plan, the heavenly blueprint. And this altar in particular, it's an interesting altar because it's similar to the altar that stood just outside the holiest of holy. That's the second part of the tabernacle, just before you enter into the holiest of holies. There was this altar, and on this altar, which is, as we've read, quite interesting, we read that incense was offered, was burnt on this altar. And in a similar way, we also read that incense was burnt on this altar in the tabernacle. But what we find here is that the incense burnt on this altar is related to the prayers of the saints. We read that, and the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. And this is quite a remarkable description. This is something that we do not find in the Old Testament, although we do find the altar in the Old Testament. But this description, once we start discussing the similarities between what Ezekiel has prophesied and what we find in Revelation, this is the one thing that's quite different. Is this in this New Testament context, we see the importance of the prayers of the holy ones, of the saints. And it's actually, he mentions the prayers before he starts discussing the different trumpets and the angels blowing the trumpets and the events that happened after the trumpets were blown. So in a certain sense, these prayers is clearly very important. It's before God. It's not clear what the reason would be. Whether these are prayers of people that's in persecution, in difficult circumstances, and that God is actually listening to their prayers and decides to go over into action and start with these different trumpets, which presents his wrath in a certain sense, and whether it's maybe seen in a different way. Maybe that God would, for example, keep back his wrath. It's not clear. I don't think there's any, the Bible doesn't really give us any indication of what is the reason why these prayers are mentioned just before the different trumpets are blown. I don't know, Carel, whether you have any ideas on that.
Thanks, Willie. Yeah, I would just like to take a small step back. We read that after the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. So one could ask the question, why was there silence in heaven? And I read somebody said, it is because of the tremendous weight of what was to follow. It was such the people even in heaven were overwhelmed because they understood that the day of the Lord is at hand. So this is like a very, very big moment in heaven when these angels are preparing to blow their trumpets. So that is how I understand it. Makes sense to me. Yes, and then on this altar of incense, or even worship, some people call it, with a very strong connection with the altar on earth, where they brought sacrifices to the Lord, which really smelled good. You know, you often read that the worship of the people was like a lovely smell, a lovely aroma to the Lord. And this is actually an amazing description of the prayers of the saints in heaven, a graphic description of the meaning of it, that the prayers of the saints going up to God in heaven, it is caught up, it is precious, it is not wasted. It's like an offering that is acceptable to the Lord. And he receives it, and he hears those prayers, and he answers it. And as you said, Willie, it's not very clear what the content of the prayers were. But if you draw the connection with the temple, it probably was both worship and intercession. But it also tells us that the prayers of the saints has an influence with God governing heaven and earth. And it was in answer to their prayers that God acted in a very powerful way here. maybe there's also a connection between the calling of the saints from the altar, which we've read. When will God, what is the word? Wanneer sal die Here hulle bloed wat gestort is,
when God will avenge the shedding of the blood
of their blood, yeah. So there could be a connection with that. But I know of many people who understand something of worship and intercession, who were inspired by the scripture. For instance, the whole harp and bowl IHOP movement in Kansas City was inspired from this text. Yes, so after the silence, there was these prayers, and then the action really started. So we can proceed maybe now to what happened then when the first angel took the trumpet and blew it.
I just want to take a second and just, if you look at the comparisons between Ezekiel and Revelation, it's not just one or two. I mean, there's a huge amount of things that run parallel in each of these books. The word comes is one, and I'm just going to mention a few because there's so many. The appearance of the Lord, the throne scene, the four living creatures, the book that's opened, the eating of the book, the siege of Jerusalem, the famine, 1/3 destruction, calls from the altar, false prophets, lamentations, and it's carrying on and on and on. So really, really fascinating and really worthwhile if you wanted to take the time to study it. But yeah, back to you guys.
Yeah, so when we look at this chapter that we discuss in chapter 8, what we find in verse 5 is that the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So here we see that this angel took fire from the altar and threw it onto the earth. Now, this is very, very similar to what we find in the book of Ezekiel. Now, in Ezekiel, the chapters that's primary of interest to us is chapters 1 and 2, a little bit from chapter 5, and then chapters 9 and 10. Now, chapters 1 and 2 and 9 and 10 also in Ezekiel are very similar because it describes the glory of the Lord. And the cherubs, the cherubim around the throne. God's throne is in this case movable. But the glory of God is depicted, and Ezekiel sees this glory in the same way that St. John saw the glory of God when he was taken to heaven. Very, very similar. What is also quite similar is after seeing the glory of the Lord, we read how Ezekiel received a book. And we read that he received a book. That's in chapter 2. Now, when I looked, there was a hand stretched out to me, and behold, a scroll of a book was in it. Now, this book, he reads in the beginning of chapter 3 that he had to eat it, and it was sweet in his mouth. Now, this is exactly what we find in Revelation chapter 11, just after the discussion of the trumpets. We also read how an angel in great glory appeared, and he stood on heaven and earth, an angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land, raised up his hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, the earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there shall be delay no longer. And then he refers to the things that will happen with the sounding of the seventh trumpet. So he comes at the end of the first 6 trumpets. It's still in the same context that we're talking about. And then we read how he gave a little book open in his hand, and he gave this book to John, And he told him, the angel told him to eat the book. And then we read, it was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And then he says, he said to me, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. So we have a lot of similarity between both cases. These are very unique images. You know, eating the book that's given to him from the hand of the angel, and in his mouth it was sweet. Now, it doesn't say that in Ezekiel, but we do read in John that after eating it in his stomach, it became bitter, because these are bitter things that he has to prophesy about. But then what is furthermore interesting in Ezekiel is that we read in chapter 9 how 6 men came from various directions and they stood before the Lord. 6, very similar to the 7 that came and stood before the Lord with the trumpets. In this case, they don't have trumpets, but they had deadly weapons. Now, we read these deadly weapons clearly agree with after the trumpets were blown, deadly things happened. The trumpet was sort of a warning. And then these very bad things happened that we'll discuss a little bit later on, which also led to people dying and so forth, very similar to what in this case is spoken of. But in this case, we have 6. Now, one of these men, again, very interesting, we read that he was clothed with linen and he had a writer's inkhorn at his side. And then we read how the Lord told him, go through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over the abominations that are done within it. So what he does is exactly what we read in the previous chapter, which we've already discussed, about 144,000, where this angel also seals these people for the wrath of God. And he also seals them on their foreheads. So it's exactly the same image that we find here in Ezekiel. And then we read how these people go through the city, these angels, and they slay everybody in the city. But in actual fact, they did not kill these people. It was just a prophecy. How these people would be killed by certain events that will overtake the city when Nebuchadnezzar took the city. So it was, in a sense, a prophecy. Very similar to the trumpets that's blown, prophecies about future events and severe things that will happen on earth, severe things that will happen. What is also interesting is we even read in Ezekiel that when again back to the book, where he says the book, he says written on it were lamentations and mourning and woe. And this is exactly what we find in Revelation chapter 8. Later on, after discussing the first 4 trumpets, after it has blown, the warnings, the things that accompanied them, then we read, woe, the angel that was flying through heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound. So the idea of a woe, it's exactly the same. Things that will happen, things that are woeful, really hurtful and serious things, many people dying and many other things happening. The kind of terminology is the same, images are the same. So there's such a lot of agreement between what we find in the book of Revelation in these few chapters, especially in this first part, from chapters 6 to 11, maybe to 10 even, but let's include 11. So these first chapters, there's a lot of agreement between what we read in Ezekiel. And I believe the reason for that is, sometimes people read the book of Revelation and they, wildly speculate about what these things could mean. And they apply it to all sorts of things that they believe could be spoken of in this case. But I think what helps is if one sort of grounds this discussion within the Old Testament prophecies, because this is in a certain sense just taking those prophecies a step further. It's like the final fulfillment of the prophecies of Ezekiel. Although it's been fulfilled with the taking of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar and all those woeful things that happened at that stage, clearly there's a kind of further fulfillment of the prophecy that is still awaiting fulfillment sometime in the future. It seems
So,
that that's
Willie, just a question. So, if you look at Ezekiel and you look at Revelation 8, are they talking about exactly the same events, or would Ezekiel refer to another or a different event, and this is just a building on that, so that flow through?
Well, I think at this stage, we don't have that clarity, because if we only look at the text before us, so we're only looking at chapter 8. We're not yet discussing chapter 9. We're not yet discussing chapter 11, where other aspects will be brought forward. But we will find definitely in chapter 11 that Jerusalem and the war against Jerusalem is spoken of.
Yes.
When the city will be trampled by the heathen. And we do read that, the city of Jerusalem. So it's clear that similar things that the prophet Ezekiel had spoken of will again in end times happen. And the city of Jerusalem will again be a centerpiece in all these events. To
So
what extent
sorry to
these
interrupt.
events will be localized in
Yep.
Israel, and to what extent they will also include the larger world at this stage. This is a sort of early stage, in the story told in Revelation. It's not clear.
That was my exact question, if it's specifically focused on just Jerusalem, or if there's a spillover effect into the wider world. Carel, I know you've got an opinion on that as well. Do you agree with Willie?
Yeah, but it is hard to not to jump to the next chapter, because it is linked. But I think what Willie emphasized here is very important when you have to understand the character, or the character of prophecy. It seems if you just jump into Revelation and read through it and jump to all kinds of conclusions, you are speculating. But if you go back to prophecies in the Old Testament and other prophecies also, like we have touched on Matthew 24 as well, the comparison between that and Revelation, but now Ezekiel. And if you compare these two prophecies, it was given by the same Spirit and the same Lord, who has his plans of the future. And as Willie also mentioned, there are very clearly more than one fulfillment of these prophecies. Because in the case of Ezekiel, this was meant for that time, when Jerusalem was destroyed, when they went into exile. But if you compare it, or even we've also talked about Exodus and the 10 plagues. That's the right word, 8 plagues in Exodus. And it seems to be repeated. But that's the interesting character of prophecy, that the Lord has got these incidents and these types that he prepares his people for something he's doing. And so it really helps me to understand Revelation. If you go back and you look at the similar prophecies also in Daniel, for instance, and you look at the similarities, then you get a much clearer picture. Yeah, so I think it's very wise not to just read Revelation and make all sorts of conclusions, but to make a proper study of the Old Testament and where God was speaking about certain things, and to understand that there are more than one time that a prophecy could be fulfilled. For instance, if you look at Joseph in the Old Testament, who saved the people of Israel, he was sold by his brothers, but in the end he became king over them, and that was a type of Christ. So it was fulfilled in Joseph in Genesis, but it was fulfilled again in Christ. So we have the same kind of quality of the other prophecies, especially those we are busy with now in Revelation.
It's the same themes get echoed right through the Bible, which gives you that consistency as well.
Yeah, I can mention we talk about mountain peaks of prophecy. Mountain peaks of prophecy. Now, people that like climbing mountains would know that I'm talking about. But when you climb a mountain, sometimes it seems that there's one peak ahead. And then as you proceed, you'll come to a point where you reach a certain peak and it flats off again, quite a lot. But the real peak is still higher up. I remember me and my wife, we were not yet married. We went to climb a mountain. And this mountain, I think, had about 7 peaks, one after the other. You know, you think you're getting to the top. And when you get where you think it's the top, it breaks down, it goes down again, it goes up again. So
the top is the final fulfillment, you mean?
Yeah. All these peaks align in certain sense. So we find that quite often with biblical prophecy. That's the multiple fulfillments of prophecy. And I think we just get a much better grip on Revelation once we include the Old Testament basis. There's a collage of images here from Ezekiel, chapters 1 and 2, and chapters 9 and 10. And if we include this collage of images, if we read Revelation in terms of these images, then it seems that very similar things, the author definitely, with good reason, used those Old Testament images. So when we get to the trumpets, so then we read, it's from chapter, we are at chapter 8, so it's from verse 6. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. And then the first trumpet sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, thrown on the earth, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass were burned up. So fire all over the world. This hail and fire mixed with blood, I personally think it may be a metaphor related to war. It's a metaphor that seems to me applies to war, maybe even foreseeing, real ammunition and so forth. Obviously, the prophet doesn't have seen it in that way, but in prophecy, God knows the future. And this particular image, I think, could very well refer to those things. So it's just that I think already at this stage, hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, could be a metaphor referring to war that has broken out on earth. And then the second one, we read about the great mountain burning with fire, thrown into the sea, and 1/3 of the sea became blood. And now this mountain, again, one can't know for sure, but maybe we're talking about a kind of nuclear explosion in the sea, something like that. I don't think we should sort of try to think that this prophet didn't know about these things, therefore the prophecy cannot be about these things. This kind of way of thinking is to me just plain wrong, because God knows the future. But he can obviously not speak further and in more detail than using metaphors in the way that God provides them and shown them to him. And then we read about the great star. After the third angel sounded, the great star that fell from heaven like a torch. It fell into the rivers and the springs. And the name was Wormwood, which means bitter. And the water became bitter because the water was made bitter. We read that the people, many men died from the water. And if the previous trumpet refers to this mountain that fell in the sea, refers to a nuclear explosion, then this could very much be radioactive material that we're talking about, radioactivity. And then we also read, in the fourth angel sounded, and the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the sun, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that they became darkened. So if these things do really happen, if it is a nuclear war that has broken out, then we will most probably find that the atmosphere will darken and all these things will happen. So I think one can read it in one way as purely, things that is just trying to describe terrible events, but it's not anything specific. We can also read it just as things that some people will maybe take this prophecy literal, in the sense that there is some kind of mountain that fell in the sea. But I have no problem in also interpreting it in modern terms as referring to future events and the great nuclear war that has broken out. So I don't know what you guys think about this.
I think it's. I'm open to to different suggestions. What I do find interesting is if you look up wormwood in the dictionary, it says it's a state or a source of bitterness and grief.
Okay.
So it might be a combination of just expressing that bitterness and grief, but also overlaid with some form of warfare, or as you suggested, perhaps a weapon of some kind. Carel, you're raising your eyebrows. Any comments from your side?
Yeah, when Willie was saying, when he started with the first trumpet, there followed hail and fire mixed with blood thrown upon the earth. Third of the earth was burned up. Third of the trees and all the green grass was burned up. I was thinking of, this war going on in the Ukraine. They actually created some photos comparing some of the cities and landscape before and after the war. For instance, what's that town? Bakhmut. And it is incredible, the difference and what the war did to that place.
Yeah.
And everything is burned down, everything is dead, everything is gray. Yeah, so maybe, Willie, if we talk about war, it could fit in this explanation. And also, sorry, about the nuclear bomb or the neutron bomb. Very interesting that the Ukrainian word for wormwood is Chernobyl. That is the actual word. And there was that accident there, and there was the radioactivity, maybe also like a sign or something pointing forward. So it really makes sense that this could affect the water. And I've also read somewhere that a nuclear war will definitely affect the atmosphere. I've read that there will be an extended winter. Even the temperature will fall, and it will affect the crops and so on for quite a few years, depending on how big the war was. So yeah, this could fit into the John's description with the images he knew of what he saw, what God showed him. It does make sense to me. And even if we continue next week to build further on these images, it does make sense to me.
Yeah, I think what is important is that this image of war in Ezekiel, it's exactly the war that is spoken of, the war of
Yes.
Nebuchadnezzar and his
And
state,
described.
battling against Jerusalem and taking the city. So this is exactly what's being spoken of. And then also when we go back to Revelation chapter 6, where we have a kind of summary of things to come. And we first have the white horse, the man on the white horse. We have already discussed that, seemingly referring to a kind of a false peace that will arrive on the world scene. But then the very next horse, the red one, refers to peace being taken away and war coming, great and terrible wars. So I think we should read Revelation in terms of war, terrible, terrible wars, and in the sense that these things relate to the end of times, the second coming of Christ, that's also depicted here, and the great battles right before the end, as we will see. I think these could very well be metaphors related to great and terrible wars happening towards the end of time.
And he does
And the
feel like
days we are living in, I remember Willie and I had a discussion, when was it, last year or so, and he said he really feel in his heart and believe in his heart that the scene on the in the world and in the governing powers of the world are shifting.
Yeah.
And we can see that, and we never expected this war between Russia and the Ukraine, and pulling in many other countries. And these things described here, becomes much more relevant. So even though the world is trying to live in peace, these things were predicted, and we are on this road. So, yeah, the Lord knows what's ahead.
Yes, it does seem that we're sort of on the edge of things to come.
Yeah, and I think next time when we'll also engage the prophecies of the prophet Joel, we will go into even more detail regarding these trumpets, especially when we do the next two trumpets. But that's for next time. But I think the theme is very much a similar one, also in Joel, great and terrible wars.
I look forward to it, but I'm starting to get more anxious about it. It's interesting. The drama's unfolding. Yeah. Any final comments, Carel?
Now, we don't want to sound doom and gloom and dark. We want to be full of the joy of the Lord.
Yes.
But the Lord is, is open with us. He said to his disciples, "You are my friends, and I'm sharing with you all that the Father gave to me." He doesn't hide it. And that makes the Bible trustworthy even more for me. The Lord is open and honest to what is going to happen. He will be with us. Those people were marked, and they were kept through the war in Ezekiel and even in Revelation. So we understand, and even in Exodus, the Israelites were kept, that the Lord is with us and he will keep us. But we know what is coming, and we can be prepared, and we can even serve those who are, grappling for answers in these difficult times lying ahead, and help them.
Willie, anything else from your side? How should we look at these events?
What just comes to mind is what Jesus said. We've seen that Matthew 24, there's a close correspondence between that prophecy, Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24, and chapter 6 in Revelation. And even chapter 7, for example, a reference to the Great Tribulation that is only found in Matthew 24 and in Revelation 7. It's only two places in the Bible. And where Jesus actually says that these things will be like birth pangs.
Yeah.
It will become more intense, more severe as the end approaches. So we shouldn't just immediately run to conclusions if we see a war or people that's doing things that we would associate with the Antichrist and say this is the Antichrist, and so on, because crying wolf all the time is not a good thing. But I do think that these things that we're seeing, obviously wars, the world, I've seen many wars in the past, and I believe they will most likely see quite a lot still to come. But eventually things will build up to this climatic moment at the end. And this war is, and war spoken of here, is clearly at a very different scale than anything that has gone before. But even in that sense, this first part is not yet, it's terrible, it's the trumpets, but when it comes to chapter 16, for example, right at the end, it's really much, much worse. And we'll get to that. Yeah, that's the final events before the coming of our Lord. Yeah.
So I can comfortably say if someone says things are really bad, I can say, you haven't seen anything yet. It's going to get much worse.
Yeah, that sounds not too optimistic, but anyhow.
But God's still on his throne.
That's true.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to the next conversation. Yeah, it's becoming really intense. But thanks for the insight and the discussion. It's been really, really good.
Thanks. Blessings.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
For more information about the Bible GPS, please visit our website at thebiblegps.com. Please subscribe to our channel, share the video, like it, and leave us a comment. You can also support our ministry by donating. All the information is in our website. Thank you and God bless.